thirsty, come.
In the beginning there was God, and God alone. He had it in his mind to create, so he spoke, "Let there be light," and there was light. God continued to speak, and with each word things were created: the sun, moon, stars, the earth. After creating everything in the heavens and the earth, God then made man. Then God made woman, and God was very pleased with his creation, and he placed the man and the woman in the middle of a beautiful garden and gave them two commands: care for his creation, and do not eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. With these instructions, the man and the woman lived, and they lived well, until one day the devil, the great liar, he approached the woman and enticed her to eat the forbidden fruit. The woman and the man both agreed to go against God's command, and they ate the fruit. At once they noticed a change. Things were different. Sin had now entered God's creation. This was the problem. Soon God came looking for the man and the woman, but they tried to hide from him because they were now afraid of their Creator. This fear they felt was a direct result of their sin. God called, and the man and the woman could hide no longer. They came and stood before the Lord, filled with guilt and shame. At once, God knew there was a change in the man and the woman, and as he asked them what had happened and listened to their answers, God knew what he would have to do. The man and the woman had embraced sin and created a separation between God and themselves. And if the man and the woman ate from the tree of life, they would live forever as they were, separated from their Creator. God did not want that. So he sent the man and the woman away from the garden and put an angel in charge of protecting the fruit from the tree of life. Before the man and the woman left, God had made a plan and made them a promise. He would create a way for them to return to their Creator. The man and the woman lived the rest of their lives outside the garden, and there they had many children. Mankind began to grow in number, but they were still separated from God. They knew God had a plan to bring them back to Him, but they weren't fully sure what it looked like. As the years went by, God continued to share more and more about this plan to bring man and woman back to Himself. But even with more and more information, not everyone believed that God would be faithful to His promise. Some people believed God's words, and some people didn't. Thousands of years went past. The people on earth were still separated from God, yet there were still a few who believed that God would remain faithful to His promise. Then it happened. A tiny baby was born in a stable. This baby was no ordinary baby. This baby was different. This baby was God's plan to bring man and woman back to Himself. This baby was God's own Son. He was sinless, pure, holy. His name, Jesus. God's plan was not finished with the birth of Jesus. God's plan was still unfolding to the world that wasn't fully aware of who this Jesus really was. Jesus grew up just like most children, going to school, helping us parents, and learning a trade. But through all these ordinary things, God's plan was unfolding. When Jesus grew up, He traveled around telling everyone he met that God's promise to bring men and women back to Himself was true. People were amazed at Jesus' teaching as He reminded everyone of God's great love for man and woman. He became so popular that every place He went, thousands of people would come to listen to Him. But there was more. While Jesus was the most amazing teacher, God allowed Him to perform miracles. The blind, they were able to see. The sick, they were made well. The crippled, they could get up and run. No matter where Jesus went, people's lives were changed. Everyone would bring their sick or blind or lame to Jesus, and He would heal them all. This was all part of God's plan, unfolding right there before the world's eyes. But the plan was still not complete. As popular as Jesus was, there were some who were jealous and wanted Jesus' fame. They were often there to hear Him teach, and they were there to see Him heal, but they were always planning on how to stop Him. This too was part of God's plan to bring man and woman back to himself. Finally, the day came. Judas, one of Jesus' closest friends, decided that money was more important than friendship and went to those who hated Jesus and agreed to betray him. They made their plan to take Jesus when the crowds weren't around and do away with him for good. Later at night, Jesus was alone with a few of his closest followers. Jesus knew that tonight God's plan would unfold a little more and that he would suffer in order to bring man and woman back to God. His closest followers, they fell asleep as Jesus was alone praying to God. Then Judas, along with a crowd armed with swords and clubs, approached Jesus. Judas kissed Jesus on the cheek. That was the sign. The men stepped forward, took Jesus, and arrested him. Jesus' followers, they awoke and began to fight to free Jesus, but Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its place. Don't you know that I could call on my Father, and he would at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would God's plan be fulfilled that says it must happen this way?" With those words, the crowd took Jesus away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where those who were jealous of Jesus had assembled. They had hoped to find false evidence concerning Jesus so that they could put him to death. But those who testified against him told stories that contradicted each other. Seeing that this false testimony wasn't working, they asked Jesus, "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus replied truthfully, saying, "I am." The crowd was enraged at his response, and they took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. Once there, they cried out to Pilate, telling him many lies about Jesus. Pilate could see the town was in an uproar over Jesus, so he questioned him privately concerning the charges brought against him. But Jesus remained silent until finally Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "You are right, for I am a king." Pilate could find nothing wrong with Jesus, so he returned to the people and said, "I find no guilt in him." It was the tradition that Pilate would release to the people one prisoner during the feast week. Pilate thought this might be a way for Jesus to go free, but the people began yelling, "Give us Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" Pilate responded, "Barabbas? The murderer? What shall I do with this Jesus?" "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" they yelled. Pilate was astonished and yelled back, "Why? What crime has he committed?" But the crowd continued to shout, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas, the murderer, and he had Jesus, the King of the Jews, flogged with a lead-tipped whip. This flogging was often called half-death, as half of the people who underwent this punishment died from the beating. Again and again, Jesus' back was hit, bruised, and cut. Finally, the flogging was over, and Jesus was turned over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. The soldiers took Jesus into the courtyard of the governor's headquarters and called out the entire regiment. They dressed the beaten and bloodied Jesus in a purple robe and placed a crown of thorns on his head. Then they gathered around and taunted him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" As they taunted, they spat on him and repeatedly struck him over the head with a stick. At last they tired of their mockery and tore the purple robe off of Jesus and gave him his cross to carry. Jesus was now badly beaten, bleeding, and barely had the strength to carry himself, let alone the cross to be crucified. The guards, seeing that Jesus was taking too long and that their insults and physical punishment no longer helped speed things up, they called a man named Simon into service to carry the cross. After the long walk through the streets, the death march finally ended at Golgotha. There Jesus was laid on the cross, and nails were taken and driven through his hands and feet to hold him to the cross. After the pounding of the hammer ceased, the cross was lifted up, and there Jesus hung for all the world to see. On his left and his right were two convicted thieves. In front of Jesus, the Roman soldiers, they cast lots for his clothing. Nailed above his head to the cross was a sign that read, "This is the King of the Jews." And standing amongst the crowd were those who wanted him dead. They yelled to the crowds, "He saved others, let him save himself. If he really is the Son of God, he should come down off that cross, and then we will worship him." after a few hours at noon, darkness came over the land, and Jesus hung on the cross, gasping for air. Eventually he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But he already knew the answer. This was God's plan, God's promise to bring man and woman back to their Creator. Later, Jesus whispered, "I am thirsty." A sponge soaked in sour wine was lifted up for him to drink. When Jesus had tasted it, he cried out, "It is finished." He breathed his last breath and died. At that moment, a violent earthquake rocked the city. Rocks were torn in two, and the veil in the temple was ripped in two pieces from top to bottom. The Roman guard who had witnessed this all stood next to the cross and declared, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." But what now? This amazing teacher, the great physician, the miracle worker, the hope of all was now dead. But why? Why would God allow this one to suffer and die? His followers left with these and many other questions running through their minds. Yet this was all part of God's promise to bring man and woman back to their God. A few of Jesus' followers went to Pilate to ask to bury Jesus' body, and after confirming that Jesus was indeed dead, Pilate allowed him to be buried. However, those that had killed Jesus were worried. After all, Jesus had claimed that he would overcome death, and they didn't want Jesus' followers to steal the body and say that Jesus was alive. So Pilate sent Roman guards to secure the tomb and make sure that nobody took Jesus' body. These soldiers guarded the tomb of Jesus with their lives. For 3 days, Jesus' followers waited and wondered what to do. Their leader, their teacher, their friend was gone. They were sad, confused, and worried. After all, were they the next to be killed? Finally, the third day came, and some of the women went to Jesus' tomb. As they walked, they wondered who would roll the stone away so that they could place their burial spices on Jesus' body. As they approached, they saw that the stone had already been removed. Who? Why? They didn't know that this was all part of God's promise to bring man and woman back to himself. They ran to the tomb and they looked only to see an angel. They stood amazed as the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen." They couldn't believe it, so they ran and they told the other followers of Jesus. And over the course of the next few days, Jesus appeared to them alive. Jesus was alive. They had so many questions for him. How could this be? Why did all this happen? However, the answer was simple. It was all part of God's most amazing plan and promise to bring man and woman, you and me, back to himself.